The next step in our journey is to consider how some of the earlier theories about young people, gender, and subculture relate to more recent stories about resistance and cyber activism. And this is where Velez's work on the activism that's been created by the rise of revenge porn becomes relevant. So, what we've had is the idea that people are born into social situations that are governed by particular discourses of gender. That is, we're born into societies that already have existing ideas about what men and women are like and what people of different gender identities can and can't do. And that in many ways, media are a place where two things happen. Firstly, media are a place where we are introduced to dominant ideas, but also the idea that those ideas are naturalized, but also media practices, the things that we do in relation to media, are also places where we can rewrite some of those discourses. Now, if we were to look at early subcultural studies, we would see that this re editing, if you like, was something that was very much done on a small scale. It was something that was practiced amongst small groups of people, and something that wasn't perhaps explicitly labeled as being political. But one of the things that we can see in relation to the topic of cyber porn is how these acts of resistance have become very powerful in terms of actually drawing social attention to the need to develop different stories about how genders are created and how they relate, and very much how this builds around the topic of agency. Now, Valeza's research is interesting in terms of agency because she starts from the premise that the notion of agency, the notion of choice, is very often something that's used against women when it comes to the issue of revenge porn. So the argument often made is that it's been an uphill battle to get the authorities in many parts of the world to view revenge porn as a legal issue, as a violation of human rights, because the operating assumption has been that women who find themselves victim of this have somehow consented to be filmed and therefore should have been somewhat wary or somewhat conscious of the idea that these images would somehow find themselves into the public realm simply because that's how social media works. And this has been a tremendous obstacle to in getting the people who have suffered from revenge pornography to find redress for the crimes that have been committed against them. Now, what we find is that when Velez talks about the victim agent double bind, there's this idea that it's been very difficult for people who have been the targets of revenge porn to get the authorities to take them seriously because they think, again, that women have somehow, somewhere consented to have their images recorded, and therefore there was a reasonable expectation that this would have happened. But what we've had really is the way that in fighting back against this, women have used social media, digital media to mount far more collective, grand scale, effective forms of organization that uses the online space to organize offline, real social space activism that's very much encouraged the authorities to rethink their position on discourses of revenge porn. So, what we have in this sense is the way that media have had an impact on how we think about gender, not simply because media are places are industries that represent gender in a particular way, but because media technologies and media practices also become places where real women in real situations can participate and change widely understood social discourses of gender. And so it's women activists who've used the combination of online and offline activities to really encourage us to see to really encourage societies to see revenge porn as the sort of criminal violation of rights which we now know it to be. So, how can we work this into these sorts of ideas into our research if we're not doing work on gender? Well, I suppose, as with most things, the topic of pornography and gender is a really valuable way of thinking about broader themes in media research and broader ideas. And the big idea that we need to think about sometimes is that media influence sometimes comes from media users. That is, that media industries don't just present us with audiences that tell us how the world is, but they also present us with resources that we can use to tell our own stories and to encourage social change by rewriting certain kinds of narratives. So, one of the things that we can say with regard to Velez's work on revenge pornography is that, as impressive as it is a variation on a theme that's been in play for quite some time. And this is that people use media narratives to manage social challenges, to challenge dominant discourses, and to rewrite them. One of the most vivid examples that I've ever encountered is something that's talked about by the researcher Mark Durs. And he talks about a series of protests that occurred that were mounted by Palestinian citizens in the West Bank town of Berlin. And you see an image of these citizens in front of you. And what these Palestinian protesters were doing was that they were protesting the division wall in the West Bank, the wall of division between the West Bank and Israel, which was mounting a serious problem of movement and economic livelihood for Palestinians living in the West Bank. Basically, it was something that was making it very hard for Palestinians to move freely, to work freely, to earn a living, all of these sorts of things. And for many years, on a Friday afternoon, Palestinian villagers had gotten into the habit in Berlin, had gotten into the habit of walking down to the border barrier at the security wall in their town and protesting the wall itself and the presence of the Israeli military there. And this was happening for years, and no one was paying much attention to it until the protesters came up with the idea of dressing like the Navi, the characters from the movie Avatar. And what they began to do was dress as characters from the movie Avatar, to express themselves, to express their cause in relation to the film narrative, to walk towards the Israeli armed forces where they would be. Subjected to tear gas. The Israeli armed forces will quite often fire tear gas at the protesters to disperse them, and they would film the whole thing. And this was something which, if you go on YouTube, you can find footage of the real thing. And this was something that very much captured the world's attention in a way that previous protests had failed to do. So, this again is an example of people changing discourses, challenging particular accounts of the security wall in Israel by taking a media narrative that people are familiar with, in this case, the movie Avatar, and using it to tell their own story, which encourages people to see the world in a different way. So, again, media influence happens because it's something that sometimes comes from media users, as media users use technologies and stories to try and tell stories about themselves that encourages the rest of the world to think about the people that they are in different ways, whether that be in relation to their identity or their gender or whatever it is. I mean, here, for example, of course, we quite often hear that the security wall is in place to protect Israel from armed terrorists. And it's very significant that the protesters in Berlin were not armed, and very often they were barely clothed as well. We have quite often images of people walking towards armed soldiers wearing nothing but a loincloth. So this is a very deliberate tactic to try and change the discourses that we have around Palestine and the West Bank. So, what does that have to do with you and your research? Well, it's really important not to think about media influence as something that just comes from media industries. So, think about how that might relate to your topic. Is media influence something that media industries are doing to people? Or are people doing things with media that influences how society sees things? So, how can you integrate this into what broadly we might call an ethnographic approach? Well, I suppose if we're taking what's broadly called an ethnographic approach to research, and if we're doing anything that involves interviewing media users, I would say that there are two broad questions that you need to include if you're doing interviewing research, which is really trying to place how people use media in a social setting. Two questions that we might see as being broadly ethnographic. Firstly, how does media use reflect life history? So, if you're talking to people who are and about their reactions to a particular media event or the dawn of a new technology, how does what they do and how they feel about that event relate to their media histories, the things that they've always done in regard to media? And secondly, how does that event or that media technology, how do those media practices fit within their social settings and practices? So, for example, how does the way that they use social media, how is that influenced by the structure of their family and the structure of their family home? That type of thing. So we're not simply asking how people use media to write their own stories about reality. We're asking about the motivations behind that. We're trying to put those media uses into a personal history and into a social context. And that's how we include an ethnographic perspective in any research that we're doing that includes interviewing.